In late 1992, inside a university computer lab in Illinois, a 21-year-old student who wasn't doing particularly well in his original major started writing code during a stretch of all-nighters fueled by chocolate chip cookies, milk, and Mountain Dew. He wasn't trying to threaten the most powerful software company on the planet. He wasn't trying to build a business at all. He was trying to make a mostly ignored corner of the internet slightly easier to look at. 2.5 years later, the company that ran Windows, the operating system installed on the overwhelming majority of the world's personal computers, would declare that this same small project represented, in the words of its own founder, a tidal wave capable of reshaping its entire future. This is the story of how a free, unglamorous piece of software, built by a handful of college students, became the single most urgent problem in Bill Gates' entire career, and how the fight it triggered ended up defining computing for the following decade. The student's name was Mark Andreessen, and the project he was working on didn't have a grand name yet, or any expectation of commercial success attached to it at all. He was working at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, a research facility at the University of Illinois, whose actual mission had nothing to do with building consumer software. NCSA existed to support scientific computing, and by the early 1990s, one of the quieter side effects of that mission was that its staff had started paying close attention to something called the World Wide Web, an obscure text-only information system invented a few years earlier by a researcher named Tim Berners-Lee, used at that point almost exclusively by physicists and academics, trading documents back and forth in a format so plain and unadorned that almost nobody outside a research institution had any reason to care about it. Andreessen, working alongside a programmer named Eric Bina, decided the web deserved something better than plain text. Over roughly 4 months spanning late 1992 and early 1993, the two of them wrote thousands of lines of code aimed at a genuinely simple, unglamorous goal. Let a person look at a web page and actually see pictures next to the words, all arranged on a single screen, rather than clicking open a separate window every time an image needed to load. That single, almost mundane usability decision, inline, images sitting directly alongside text, turned out to be the specific detail that made the web comprehensible to an ordinary person for the first time. They called the resulting piece of software Mosaic. Nobody at NCSA treated this as a strategically important product in the making. It was released for free in the spirit of NCSA's broader academic mission to produce useful, widely available research tools rather than commercial software. Andreessen, according to people who worked alongside him at the time, wasn't primarily motivated by the idea of building something world-changing either. Colleagues later described him as someone who simply wanted his browser used by as many people as possible, someone who spent his time on early internet news groups, listening intently to what users wanted, folding their requests into new versions almost as fast as people could ask for them. There were only about 50 known web servers in existence in January of 1993. The same month Mosaic's first version quietly went out into the world. By October of that same year, that number had grown past 500. By the following June, it had passed 1,500. Mosaic wasn't causing that growth entirely on its own, but it was making the growing web usable for people who had never touched a research network in their lives, and downloads climbed past 2 million within its first year of existence. That's the moment worth sitting with, before the story moves any further, because it's the part that tends to get flattened in the more famous later chapters of this history. A tiny, unfunded academic side project, built by a college student not particularly happy with his original major, was quietly making the internet accessible to ordinary people, years before any major technology company had decided the internet was worth taking seriously as a business at all, least of all Microsoft, the company that would eventually be forced to treat this exact lineage of software as an existential threat. Andreessen graduated from the University of Illinois in 1993 and moved to Silicon Valley, initially taking a job at a small company unrelated to browsers entirely. That might have been the end of the story, if not for a phone call from a man named Jim Clark. Clark had recently left Silicon Graphics, the company he'd founded and built into one of the most respected names in high-end computer graphics, and he was searching for his next venture. A friend showed him Mosaic in January of 1994, and Clark, with the specific kind of pattern recognition that had already made him wealthy once, immediately understood there was a real business hiding inside what NCSA had built purely as an academic project. He tracked down Andreessen, the two of them met, and within months they'd founded a company initially called Mosaic Communications Corporation, later renamed to avoid a legal dispute with the university whose name it had borrowed. It became Netscape Communications. Here's where the story starts to escalate, because Netscape wasn't simply Mosaic rebuilt with a fresh coat of paint. Andreessen, working with a team largely recruited from the original NCSA Mosaic group, built an entirely new browser from scratch, deliberately independent of the code he'd left behind at the university. Around the office, The new browser carried an unofficial nickname that captured exactly what its creators believed they were building. Mozilla, short for Mosaic Killer, complete with a green, know-it-all looking stuffed lizard mascot, sitting on desks throughout the company. The actual product, released in October of 1994, shipped under the name Netscape Navigator, and it was immediately obviously better than anything that had come before it. Faster, more stable, capable of displaying a page's content progressively as it downloaded, rather than forcing users to wait for the entire thing to finish loading before seeing anything at all. Netscape's business model was itself a genuinely clever piece of strategic thinking, worth understanding because of how directly it shaped everything that happened next. The browser was free for individual users and students to download and use. Corporations, on the other hand, paid real licensing fees, $49 per seat for a site license. That combination, genuinely free consumer access, paired with real corporate revenue, did something enormously consequential very quickly. It got Navigator onto an enormous share of the small but explosively growing number of computers actually connecting to the web, while still generating enough revenue to fund extremely rapid continuous development. New versions shipped every few months. And because Navigator was so quickly becoming the dominant way ordinary people actually experienced the web, Netscape found itself with a kind of leverage that went well beyond simply selling a good product. If Navigator supported a particular feature, web. Developers built for that feature, because that's where their actual audience was. Controlling the browser meant, in a very real sense, controlling the technical direction of the emerging web itself. By 1995, Navigator ran on roughly 90% of the computers accessing the web. And in August of that year, Netscape went public in an initial public offering that raised $140 million and pushed the company's valuation past $2 billion within hours of trading, an almost unheard of number for a company that had existed in any form for barely 16 months, and that had never actually turned a profit. The IPO is now widely remembered as the specific moment the entire technology, industry, and Wall Street along with it, first understood that genuinely enormous value could be built around the internet itself, rather than around the traditional software products the industry had spent the previous 2 decades selling. It's often cited as the opening bell of the entire dot-com era that would go on to define the rest of the decade. Mark Andreessen, 24 years old, found his own personal stake in the company suddenly worth $58 million. Asked about it afterward, he offered a characteristically understated response. He'd woken up, logged in to check how the stock had performed, and gone back to sleep. His explanation was that he genuinely believed the euphoria was temporary, and that the team couldn't afford to be distracted by it. He was right about the euphoria being temporary. He didn't yet know that Netscape's own dominance would prove equally temporary, and for reasons that had almost nothing to do with anything, Netscape itself had done wrong. Because 5 months before that IPO, on the other side of the country in Redmond, Washington, Bill Gates had already had a genuinely uncomfortable realization of his own. On May 26, 1995, he sent a memo to Microsoft's executive staff carrying a title that would go on to become one of the most famous internal documents in the entire history of the technology industry, the Internet Tidal Wave. In it, Gates described the Internet not as a peripheral curiosity, but as a force that changed the fundamental rules of the industry Microsoft had spent the previous 2 decades dominating. The Internet is a tidal wave, Gates wrote. It changes the rules. It is an incredible opportunity as well as incredible challenge. He acknowledged, with genuine candor, that his own understanding of its importance had gone through several distinct stages of escalation before he finally arrived at this specific level of alarm. It's worth understanding exactly what had triggered that alarm, because it wasn't simply Netscape's growing user numbers on their own. It was something Andreessen himself had started saying publicly, with a level of confidence that bordered on open provocation. Andreessen had begun describing Netscape not merely as a browser company, but as the foundation of an entirely new kind of operating system, one that could run on top of any underlying computer, regardless of whether that computer happened to be running Windows, and one that would eventually make the specific operating system underneath almost irrelevant to the actual experience of using a computer. He went as far as predicting, in public, that Netscape would eventually reduce Windows itself to nothing more than a poorly debugged set of device drivers. A genuinely pointed insult aimed directly at the exact product Microsoft's entire business was built around. That's the specific threat Gates was actually responding to in his memo, and it's worth being precise about why it mattered so much more than an ordinary competing product would have. Microsoft's entire business model depended on Windows remaining the essential foundation every other piece of software had to be built for. If a browser could become powerful and standardized enough to run genuinely sophisticated applications inside itself, working identically regardless of the operating system underneath it, Then the specific operating system running on any given machine would matter considerably less to software developers and ordinary users alike. Windows' entire strategic value came from being the platform everything else depended on. Netscape, in Andreessen's own stated ambition, was explicitly trying to make that platform interchangeable and potentially irrelevant. Gates's memo made Microsoft's new priority unmistakably clear. Netscape, he wrote, was a company Microsoft would need to match and beat. Bolstered by direct, explicit support from the very top of the company, Microsoft's engineering organization shifted dramatically, and the specific strategy that emerged became known internally through a separate memo written by a Microsoft engineer named Jay Allard, titled Windows, the Next Killer Application for the Internet. Allard's approach rested on three specific pillars. Embrace the web's existing open standards rather than trying to replace them outright. Extend those standards specifically toward Microsoft's own ecosystem wherever possible. And, less remembered today but genuinely present in the original strategy, actually innovate and improve the underlying web technology itself. Microsoft's first real attempt to compete directly wasn't especially impressive. After a failed effort to acquire a smaller browser company called Booklink, which America Online swooped in and outbid Microsoft on, the company negotiated a licensing deal with a firm called Spyglass, which held the commercial rights to the original Mosaic code that Andreessen and his colleagues had built years earlier at NCSA before Netscape had ever existed. Internet Explorer version 1, released in August of 1995, was built directly on top of that licensed Mosaic code, meaning Microsoft's first browser and Netscape's browser both ultimately traced back to the exact same small academic project, now competing fiercely against each other under two entirely different corporate banners. That first version of Internet Explorer was, by nearly every contemporary account, genuinely bad. Buggy, slow, missing basic features, Navigator already handled smoothly. Netscape, watching this first underwhelming competitor arrive, had little reason for concern. But Microsoft had one advantage no amount of Netscape's engineering talent or head start could neutralize, and it's the advantage that ultimately decided this entire fight. Windows 95 was already installed on the overwhelming majority of new personal computers being sold. Starting with later versions, Microsoft began bundling Internet Explorer directly into Windows itself, at no additional charge, pre-installed and ready to use the moment a new computer was turned on for the first time. An ordinary consumer no longer had to actively seek out and install a browser at all. One was simply already there, sitting on the desktop, requiring zero additional effort. Within 4 years of that first unimpressive release, Internet Explorer had climbed to 75% market share. By 1999, it had reached 99%. That specific tactic, bundling a product directly into the dominant operating system to eliminate a competitor's advantage almost overnight, regardless of the bundled product's own underlying technical quality, triggered exactly the kind of federal antitrust action that would go on to define Microsoft's public reputation for the following decade. The core argument prosecutors eventually made was straightforward. Microsoft wasn't winning the browser war primarily by building a better browser. It was winning by leveraging its existing overwhelming dominance in one market, operating systems, to crush a genuine, independently superior competitor in an entirely separate market it didn't yet control. That case, and the broader scrutiny it brought down on Microsoft's competitive conduct throughout the late 1990s, would eventually connect directly to other episodes. This channel has covered the documented pricing pressure Microsoft's OEM division applied against Linux-friendly hardware manufacturers a few years later, following almost exactly the same underlying institutional instinct. Control the platform, and you control what runs on top of it, regardless of which specific competitor happens to be threatening that control in any given year. Netscape didn't simply disappear quietly once Internet Explorer's dominance became overwhelming. In a genuinely significant, forward-looking decision, the company chose to open source its own browser codebase, giving the underlying code away freely to a newly formed nonprofit organization called it Mozilla, the same nickname that had once been Netscape's own internal joke about killing Mosaic, now repurposed as the name of the organization tasked with keeping an open, independent browser alive after Netscape itself could no longer compete commercially. That codebase, rebuilt and refined over years by a genuinely dedicated community of contributors, eventually became Firefox, released in 2002, which went on to meaningfully erode Internet Explorer's dominance over the following decade, pulling its market share down from near total control to roughly 50% by 2010. So think about the actual complete shape of this story, from its very first quiet moment to its final, ironic resolution. It began with a college student not particularly happy with his original major, spending a few months writing code purely to make an obscure research network slightly easier to look at, with zero commercial ambition attached to the effort at all. That tiny, freely given academic project eventually grew, through a chance meeting with a wealthy entrepreneur searching for his next venture, into a company confident enough to publicly threaten to reduce Microsoft's entire operating system to a poorly debugged afterthought. That threat was serious enough, and specific enough that it forced the single wealthiest, most powerful software executive on the planet to write an internal memo declaring the company's previous strategic priorities suddenly, urgently obsolete. And the resulting fight, which Microsoft ultimately won through sheer platform leverage rather than clean technical superiority, became consequential enough to trigger a landmark federal antitrust case that shaped how regulators would think about dominant technology platforms for decades afterward. And even that wasn't really the end of it. The specific piece of code Netscape gave away for free when it could no longer compete. Commercially, eventually grew into Firefox, which spent the following decade proving that Microsoft's browser dominance, however overwhelming it appeared at its peak in 1999, was never actually permanent or unassailable either. The tiny academic project that started this entire chain of events never really disappeared. It simply kept mutating into new forms, under new names, under new organizational structures, continuing to shape how ordinary people actually access the internet for more than 3 decades, all the way through to the browsers most people are using to watch this video right now. I want to know what you make of this arc, now that you've seen the full distance it traveled. From a handful of college students staying up late on cookies and Mountain Dew, to a federal antitrust case that reshaped how the entire industry thinks about platform power. Does it change how you think about Microsoft's later better documented fights against Linux and open source, knowing the company had already fought and largely won an earlier, strikingly similar battle against another freely distributed piece of software just a few years before? And do you think a small, unfunded academic project could realistically pull off something this consequential again today against companies with vastly more market power and vastly more sophisticated defensive playbooks than Microsoft had in 1995? Tell me in the comments. I think this is exactly the kind of story that deserves to be understood as one continuous connected arc, rather than a handful of separate disconnected facts about browsers, memos, and lawsuits. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories behind the technology that shaped our world, subscribe to Hidden Historian. There's another story waiting to be uncovered.